1 year passed aboard the crown ship before the recall order finally came from Earth, and in that time, everything had changed in ways that Elias could never have predicted when he first stepped aboard the vessel with his daughter's hand held tightly. In his own, the diplomatic mission had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, and trade agreements were signed and cultural exchanges were established, and a foundation was laid for cooperation between humanity and the Velathari Empire that would reshape the political landscape of the entire galaxy for generations to come. But Elias knew in his heart that the real success had nothing to do with treaties or trade routes or territorial boundaries drawn on star maps. It had everything to do with Bubbles. In the months following his audience with the Queen, he noticed subtle changes in the way the Velathari treated him and Maya, and there was a softening in their clicking voices and a curiosity in their many eyes that had not been there before. They asked questions now, and they were hesitant and awkward questions about human customs and emotions and the strange practice called play, and Elias answered them as best he could, while Maya demonstrated by running through the corridors, laughing and singing and being utterly and wonderfully human. The Queen herself had requested several more private audiences where she asked Elias to explain concepts that her civilization had discarded millennia ago, and he found himself teaching the ruler of 11 star systems about bedtime stories and birthday parties and the way a parent's heart could break and heal. At the same time, Maya had become something of a celebrity among the younger Velathari officials, and they watched her with their 17 eyes and clicked among themselves about the fascinating creature who found joy in absolutely everything. She had even made something like friends, although the concept was still foreign to beings who had never experienced companionship. And Elias watched with wonder as his daughter taught ancient aliens how to play hide and seek in the corridors of their own ship. But now it was time to go home, and Elias felt a strange mix of relief and sadness as he packed their belongings into cases designed for interstellar travel. Maya helped by carefully wrapping Mr. Flopsy in her favorite blanket and telling the stuffed rabbit all about the adventures they had shared among the stars. The farewell ceremony was unlike anything seen in Velathari space in living memory, and it was a formal acknowledgement of departure that the Queen herself attended in person, and Elias stood with Maya in the great reception hall, surrounded by thousands of clicking dignitaries. Queen Sithara approached them slowly, and her massive form moved with ancient grace, and when she stopped before the two humans, the entire hall fell silent with anticipation. Ambassador Vance, she said, and her voice resonated with something that almost sounded like warmth. And you have taught my people something we did not know we had forgotten. We are grateful for this gift beyond what our words can express. She gestured, and an attendant came forward bearing a small container made of living material that pulsed softly with its own internal light. Maya took it with wide eyes and careful hands and looked up at her father for permission before opening the lid. Inside lay a wand unlike anything Elias had ever seen, and it was a crystalline rod grown from Velathari bioresin that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows, and it was unbreakable and eternal and more beautiful than the cheap plastic toy that had changed everything. Beside it rested a vial of solution that seemed to glow from within, and when Maya looked at the Queen with questions in her eyes, the ancient ruler leaned down to speak to her directly. These bubbles will last for hours, little one, Sithara explained, and they will drift on air currents and catch light in ways your human eyes have never seen. We made them specifically for you so that you might always have beauty to focus on when the universe feels sharp and frightening. Maya's smile was brighter than any star Elias had ever seen. Thank you, she said in the simple way of children, and then she did something that made every Velathari in the hall freeze with shock. She stepped forward and hugged the Queen and wrapped her small arms around one of Sithara's great legs and squeezed with all the love in her heart. The hall was silent, as the ruler of 11 star systems stood motionless with a human child embracing her. And then something remarkable happened. Queen Sithara reached down with one limb and gently patted Maya's head, and her mandibles formed words that had never been spoken by a Velathari ruler in 40,000 years of history. "Our welcome, little one," she said, "and may you always find softness in sharp places." The attendant also carried a note written in Velathari script and translated into English, and Elias read it later aboard the transport ship carrying them home for the small one. The note said, "And may she always find softness in sharp places, and may purposelessness guide her through despair. The Velathari do not understand joy, but we have observed it, and we believe it may be the most powerful force your strange species possesses. Blow bubbles, ambassador, and teach the stars to play 40. Years passed like dreams fading into morning light. Maya stood in the great hatching chamber of the Velathari throne world, and she was no longer a small child, but a diplomat in her own right, and Earth's first ambassador to the species that had witnessed her worst moment and learned from her recovery. She carried the crystalline wand her father had passed down when he retired, and it was the same wand Queen Sithara had given her when she was 4 years old and frightened and far from home. The solution still glowed as if made yesterday, and Maya had never found the bottom of it, no matter how many bubbles she blew. The queen was ancient now, and her advisors whispered that she would pass into silence soon, and that the great mind that had ruled for 3,000 years was finally preparing to rest. But she had asked to see Maya one final time, and Maya had come with a very specific purpose. The hatching chamber was filled with young Velathari who had just emerged from their shells and were experiencing consciousness for the very first time, and they looked at Maya with fresh eyes that held no preconceptions. Maya dipped the crystalline wand into the eternal solution and lifted it to her lips. She blew, and bubbles filled the hatching chamber and drifted among the young Velathari like messengers from another way of being, and they caught the bioluminescent light and transformed it into colors that seemed to come from dreams. The young ones watched with all 17 of their eyes and tracked the floating spheres with a focus their attendants had never seen, and then one of them reached out a trembling limb to touch a bubble that had drifted within reach. It popped against the young one's chitin, and something happened that Maya had been hoping for, and that the queen had been wondering about for 4 decades. The young Velathari made a sound that was not quite human laughter, and it was not quite the clicking of adult Velathari speech, but it was something in between, and something new and unprecedented and wonderful. Other young ones joined in and reached for bubbles and made the strange sound when they popped, and the attendants stepped back in confusion, while observers transmitted recordings to scientists throughout the empire. Queen Sithara watched from the edge of the chamber, and her ancient body was supported by machines now, but her mind was still sharp enough to understand what she was witnessing. She had wondered for 40 years if joy could be taught, and if the thing that humans possessed and her people had lost could somehow be recovered, and now she had her answer. The young ones were laughing. It was a sound that had not been heard in Velathari space for over 30,000 years, and a sound that their ancestors had eliminated in the pursuit of efficiency. But somehow it had survived in the potential of their species and waited for someone to show them. Maya looked at the queen across the chamber full of drifting bubbles and laughing children, and human and Velathari met each other's eyes with understanding that transcended species and history and everything that should have made them strangers. She lifted the crystalline wand in salute, and the queen nodded slowly with all 17 eyes closed in what Maya knew was contentment and peace. Her father had been right all along, and her mother had known it before either of them. The universe was vast and cold and full of beings who had forgotten how to play, but humanity would remind them. One bubble at a time. Joy was not a weakness after all. It was the greatest gift they had to give, and they would share it with every species and every world and every child who had forgotten how to laugh until the whole galaxy remembered what it meant to play, and, somewhere across the stars, a little girl's. Terror had become a woman's purpose, and a father's desperate act of love had become a gift that would echo through the ages, all because he blew bubbles to calm her, and the Queen was watching. The throne chamber was the largest enclosed space that Elias had ever entered in his entire life, and it was a vast cathedral of living architecture that stretched upward into shadows so deep they seemed to swallow light itself, and he felt smaller than he had ever felt as he walked the long path toward the dais where Queen Sithara waited for him. The walls were made of something that might have been chitin, or might have been stone, or might have been something else entirely, and they had been grown over millennia into patterns that hurt his human eyes to look at for too long, and the spiraling designs followed mathematical principles that his mind could sense but could never hope to comprehend. Belantis's organisms pulsed softly in alcoves and along the impossibly high ceiling, and they cast shifting blue and purple light across everything, and the air smelled of something ancient and alien that reminded Elias of deep caves and ocean trenches and places where humans were. Never meant to venture Evalathri advisors lined the path on either side, and there were hundreds of them standing motionless on their 6 segmented legs, with their 17 eyes tracking his every step, and the soft clicking of their mandibles created a constant background sound like rain falling gently on Metal Queen Sithara, set upon a throne that was not really a throne at all, but rather a living creature that had been bred for this single purpose over countless generations, and its flesh pulsed slowly beneath her massive form, as if keeping time with a heartbeat that had been beating since before humanity discovered fire. She was enormous and far larger than any Velathari that Elias had encountered during his months aboard. The ship in her carapace was scarred with the marks of ages, and her 17 eyes gleamed with an intelligence that seemed to pierce through every defense he had ever built around his heart. He stopped at the designated spot, which was a circle of different colored flooring that marked the proper distance for addressing the throne, and he bowed deeply in the manner he had been taught during his extensive diplomatic training back on Earthrise Human. The Queen commanded, and her voice resonated through the translation implant behind his ear with deep harmonics that made his teeth ache and his bones vibrate. "And tell me your name so that I may know who stands before me." "Ambassador Elias Vance of Earth, Your Majesty," he replied with as much steadiness as he could muster while his heart pounded in his chest. The Queen regarded him for a long moment with all 17 of her ancient eyes, and Elias felt himself being weighed and measured by a mind that had been contemplating the mysteries of the universe since before his species had developed written language or built their first cities. "You will explain," she said finally, and her great mandibles formed each word with careful precision, as if she were speaking a language that was foreign to her very nature. "What you did to the small one in your quarters." Elias swallowed against a sudden dryness in his throat, and he wondered what exactly the Queen had seen through her monitoring systems, and how much trouble he might be in for his strange human behavior. She was frightened. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, while choosing his words with the skill of a lifetime diplomat, "and I did what I could to calm her distress." With the spheres the Queen pressed, and her voice held an intensity that made the advisors around the chamber shift uneasily on their many legs. "Bubbles," he confirmed while fighting the urge to fidget under her penetrating 17-eyed gaze. "Yes, Your Majesty, I use bubbles. They serve no purpose that my advisors can identify." "No, Your Majesty, they do not serve any practical purpose. They accomplish nothing of measurable value." "No, Your Majesty, they accomplish nothing that can be measured. They are wasteful of resources, and they are irrational in their application. And they are inefficient by every measure that my civilization has developed over 40,000 years of continuous advancement and optimization." "Yes," Elias admitted, and he lifted his chin slightly despite the fear that coiled in his stomach. "Yes, Your Majesty, They are all of those things, and I use them anyway. Queen was silent for a moment that stretched out like eternity, and the advisors around the chamber clicked among themselves in what might have been confusion or disapproval, or perhaps something else that humans had no name for. Yet Sithara said slowly, and her great mandibles formed each word with careful and deliberate precision. The small one ceased her distress response entirely within minutes of your application. Of these purposeless fears, her fear terminated and her panic subsided, and her physical symptoms of emotional dysfunction were resolved more quickly and more completely than any Thalathari medical intervention could ever have achieved. She leaned forward on her living throne, and Elias could see the ancient scars on her carapace, catching the bioluminescent light like a map of all the ages she had witnessed. She laughed. The queen continued, and she pronounced the unfamiliar word as if it were a term from a foreign language. She was still learning to speak for the very first time, and you altered her fundamental emotional state through the application of utter purposelessness. Explained this phenomenon to me, Ambassador Vance, for I have ruled 11 star systems for 3,000 years, and I do not understand what I witnessed on my monitoring screens, and I find that I must understand it. Elias took a deep breath, and he thought about Sarah and about how she had always explained difficult things to Maya with such patience and love, and about how she had believed that the most important truths were also the simplest ones. It is not purposelessness, Your Majesty, he said quietly, and his voice was steady now, despite everything, because he knew that what he was about to say was true, and it is something that my people call joy. The queen repeated, and the word clicked strangely through her mandibles, as if it were a sound that her species had never been designed to make. The bubbles gave her something beautiful to focus on. Elias continued, and something gentle and soft in a moment when everything around her felt sharp and dangerous and overwhelming. They reminded her that the universe is not only emergency and crisis and pain, and that there can also be wonder and play and things that exist simply because they are lovely and not because they serve any measurable function. He paused for a moment to gather his thoughts, and he felt the weight of millions of Valathari eyes upon him as he tried to explain something that humans understood in their bones, but had never needed to put into words. Your people removed emotion from yourselves long ago, Your Majesty, he said, and I understand why you did it, because emotions can be inefficient and painful and distracting from the serious work of survival and building an empire. But in removing the pain, you also removed something else, and something that my people have learned to treasure above almost anything else in existence. We call it play, and it is how our children learn and grow and heal from wounds that no medicine can touch. We call it joy, and it is what makes existence bearable when everything seems impossible and the darkness threatens to swallow us whole. We call it love, and it is why I could not leave my daughter behind, even for the most important diplomatic mission in all of human history, because she is more important to me than any treaty or any achievement or any honor the galaxy could offer. He saw something flicker in the queen's ancient eyes, and something that might have been recognition or curiosity or simply the light playing tricks on his human perception. Your species is very strange, Ambassador Vance, she said after a long pause that seemed to stretch across centuries. Yes, Your Majesty, Elias agreed without any hesitation, because he knew it was true. You are fragile and short-lived, and you are prone to emotional responses that compromise your efficiency at every possible turn. And you waste resources on purposeless activities, and you form attachments that cause you tremendous pain when they are inevitably broken by time or distance or death. Yes, Your Majesty, all of that is true. And yet the queen continued, and her voice grew thoughtful in a way that made the advisors around the chamber shift with visible unease, because they had never heard their ruler speak this way. Your species is spread across 1,000 worlds in mere centuries. You have survived plagues that killed billions of your kind, and wars that devastated entire continents, and catastrophes that should have ended your civilization. A dozen times over, according to every logical projection. Your children break as I witnessed in my monitoring feed. Today, and they shatter under the weight of fear and loss and grief. And yet you blow bubbles for them, and somehow they rise again laughing as if nothing had ever happened at all. She leaned back on her living throne, and all 17 of her eyes remained fixed on the small human standing before her. We have studied your species for 200 cycles, and we have failed utterly to understand your persistence and your illogical and utterly irrational refusal to surrender to despair, even when every reasonable calculation suggests that you should give up and accept defeat now. I begin to understand, she said, and there was something almost like respect in her ancient voice that made the advisors click in confusion because they had never heard their queen speak to any lesser species in such a manner. You survive not because you are efficient, ambassador, and not because you are logical or powerful or optimized for success in any measurable way. You survive because you can blow bubbles for a crying child and somehow call it meaningful. You survive because you carry joy in your pockets and love in your hearts. The small plastic wand had cost less than $2 at a convenience store near their apartment back on Earth, and it was a cheap toy purchased on impulse when Elias was buying supplies for the long journey ahead, and he had tucked it into his pocket that morning without really knowing why he felt the need to carry it with him. Sarah had always kept bubbles in her purse for moments just like this one, and she kept them ready for the times when Maya's emotions became too big for her small body to hold, and some part of Elias had remembered this wisdom even through the fog of grief and preparation that had consumed those final weeks before their departure from everything they had ever known. He had carried the wand with him every day since they arrived on the crown ship, and it was a small weight in his pocket that reminded him of his wife and the simple wisdom she had possessed about raising their daughter and about turning tears into laughter with nothing more than soap and air and a little bit of magic. Now his fingers closed around the plastic handle like it was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man in a dark and endless ocean. Maya was still sobbing against his chest, and her breath was coming in ragged gasps that seemed to tear themselves from her throat, and her small hands clutched his shirt so tightly that her knuckles had turned white from the desperate pressure of her grip. He shifted her in his arms so that she was sitting on his lap and facing outward, and he pulled the wand from his pocket with his free hand while keeping his other arm wrapped securely around her trembling body to keep her safe and close. The solution container was built into the handle, and it was a small reservoir of soapy liquid that had somehow survived 6 months in space without drying out or leaking, and Elias dipped the plastic ring into it with hands that shook slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He took a slow breath to steady himself, and he remembered how Sarah would do this with such patience and care, and he remembered how she treated the simple act of blowing bubbles like it was the most important thing in the entire universe, because to Maya it truly was. Then he lifted the farthest wand to his lips, and he blew. A single bubble emerged from the ring, and it wobbled slightly as it freed itself from the thin film of soap, and it floated upward into the cold, recycled air of the Velathari ship like a tiny miracle made of nothing but light and water and hope. The bubble caught the blue-white glow of the bioluminescent ceiling panels, and suddenly it was no longer just a sphere of soap, but it had become a floating prism that split the alien light into colors that seemed to belong to a different and gentler world. Entirely. Maya's sobs hitched in her chest, and the rhythm of her crying was interrupted by something unexpected, and her red and swollen eyes tracked the bubble as it drifted slowly past her tear-streaked face. Elias blew another bubble, and then another, and he sent them rising in a gentle parade that filled the space above their heads with drifting spheres of iridescent wonder that caught the light and scattered it like scattered dreams. The bubbles were completely useless by any objective measure, and they served no function, and they solved no problem, and they contributed nothing of practical value to the situation at hand, and the medical drones hovering at the edge of the room processed their presence as irrelevant environmental contamination that did not require any response. But Maya stopped screaming, she stopped thrashing, and she stopped hyperventilating, and she stopped making that terrible sound of absolute anguish that had been tearing through the air like a wound in the fabric of the world itself. Her breath was still shaky, and her face was still wet with tears, and her small body still trembled with the aftershocks of her panic. But something had changed in her eyes as she watched the bubbles float and spin and catch the light. In their delicate surfaces, Elias kept blowing, and he filled the room with dozens of fragile spheres that drifted on currents of air too subtle to feel, and each bubble seemed to carry away a little piece of his daughter's terror. As it floated toward the ceiling, Maya reached out with one trembling hand, and her fingers were still marked with thin red lines from the cuts that the medical drones were waiting so patiently to treat. And she touched a bubble that had floated within her reach. It popped against her fingertip with a tiny burst of moisture, and it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and the corners of Maya's mouth twitched upward in what might have been the very beginning of a smile breaking through the storm. "Our daddy," she whispered, and her voice was hoarse and broken from crying, but it was somehow already lighter than it had been just moments before, when she had been lost in the darkness of her fear. Elias blew more bubbles, and he angled the wand to send them in different directions, and he created a swirling constellation of soap and light that surrounded them both like a protective barrier against everything cold and sharp and frightening. In the universe, Maya laughed. It was a small sound, and it was wet and fragile, and still tangled up with the tears that continued to leak from her eyes, but it was unmistakably laughter, and it was the first spark of joy breaking through the overwhelming darkness of her fear. Like sunlight through storm clouds, she reached for another bubble, and then another, and she popped them one by one with her fingertips while her breathing slowly steadied and her trembling gradually eased, and the color began to return to her pale cheeks. Elias felt tears prick at his own eyes as he watched his daughter come back to herself, and as he witnessed the simple miracle of a child's resilience expressed through nothing more than the pursuit of floating spheres that meant nothing and everything at the same time. He blew bubbles until his lips were tired and his breath was short, and he blew until the medical drones had quietly moved closer and treated Maya's cuts without her even noticing their cold mechanical touch. He blew until the small container of solution was nearly empty, and until the room was filled with a faint smell of soap that seemed impossibly out of place on an alien warship built for beings who had never known the simple pleasure of playing with bubbles. In the afternoon sun, Maya caught one last bubble between her palms, and she held it gently as if it were the most precious treasure in all the universe, and she watched with wonder as it sat there for a long, perfect moment before finally popping and leaving only a trace of moisture on her soft skin. She turned in his arms and looked up at him with eyes that still held shadows of fear, but also something brighter, and something that Elias recognized from the days before Sarah got sick, when their little family had been whole and the future had seemed full of nothing but wonderful possibility. "Thank you, Daddy," she said in a small voice filled with exhaustion and love. And then she yawned with the sudden tiredness that always follows intense emotional release, and within minutes she was asleep in his arms with Mr. Flopsy clutched against her chest. Elias held her and rocked her gently and let his own tears fall freely as he grieved and felt grateful in equal measure, while he breathed in the faint scent of soap bubbles that still lingered in the recycled air around them. In the throne chamber of the crown ship Queen Sithara had not moved for 47 minutes, and her massive form sat motionless on her living throne as her 17 eyes remained fixed on the monitoring feed. She watched the human child sleep peacefully in her father's arms, and she watched the fading remnants of soap solution evaporate slowly into the recycled air, and she tried to understand what she had just witnessed. The advisors had long since fallen silent, and they were confused by their queen's unprecedented attention to such a trivial matter, and they waited with growing uncertainty for her to issue commands or return to the important business of governing an interstellar empire that spanned 11 star systems. But Sithara simply watched, and her ancient mind processed what she had observed with something that felt disturbingly like confusion and wonder mixed together. In ways she had not experienced in millennia, the spheres had served no purpose that she could identify, and they accomplished nothing measurable, and they solved no practical problem, and yet they had achieved something that all the advanced medical technology of her civilization could not. They had transformed screaming terror into peaceful sleep. They had turned anguish into laughter. They had healed a wound that existed in no physical location, and a damage that no scanner could detect, and a breakage that the Velithari had no name for because they had eliminated such inefficiencies from themselves. Many thousands of years ago, the Queen turned away from the monitoring feed at last, but she did not return to the reports waiting for her attention or the advisors waiting for her commands. Instead, she sat in silence on her living throne and thought about bubbles floating in alien light, and for the first time in 3,000 years, she found herself with a question that her vast intelligence could not answer no matter how hard she tried. She would need to speak with the human directly, she decided, and her advisors clicked in surprise when she announced that Ambassador Elias Vance was to be summoned to an audience with the throne itself. She wanted to understand how something so inefficient could possibly be so powerful. The warning alarms began without any notice, and a sharp and piercing sound cut through the recycled air of the crown ship like a blade through silk, and Elias was on his feet before his mind had fully processed what was happening around him. Emergency acceleration, the automated voice announced in the clicking Velithari language, and then it repeated the warning in translated English for the benefit of the human visitors aboard the vessel, and all personnel were advised to secure themselves immediately. For their own safety, Elias ran toward his quarters with his heart pounding against his ribs, like a trapped animal desperate for escape, because Maya was alone, and she would be scared, and she needed him more than she had ever needed anything in her short and difficult life. The ship lurched hard to one side as he rounded a corner, and the violent motion threw him against the wall with enough force to bruise his shoulder. But he pushed himself forward and kept running because nothing in the universe mattered except reaching his daughter before something terrible happened. He burst through the door of their quarters just as the second lurch came, and this one was even more violent than the first, and the world seemed to tilt sideways as the artificial gravity struggled to compensate for maneuvers that the crown ship had not performed in centuries. The shelf on the far wall came loose from its mounting, and Elias saw it happen in terrible slow motion as the heavy structure tipped forward and sent its contents cascading down toward the floor, where Maya stood frozen with Mr. Flopsy clutched tightly against her small chest. Glass shattered everywhere as decorative items and containers and a small mirror that Maya had liked to look at all crashed against the hard metal floor, and the sound was like 100 windows breaking at once, and it was sharp and violent and impossibly loud in the small space where his daughter stood. Maya screamed as fragments showered over her, and tiny pieces of broken glass caught in her hair and bounced off her arms and left thin red lines where they kissed her skin in passing. Like cruel little knives made of light, Elias crossed the room in 3 desperate strides and pulled her into his arms, and he shielded her body with his own. As the last pieces of debris settled around them on the cold metal floor, he could feel her trembling against his chest like a small bird caught in a storm, and her whole body shook with a fear that seemed too big for someone so young to contain. She was not badly hurt, he realized as he quickly checked her over with shaking hands, and he found only a few small cuts on her forearms that were already welling up with drops of bright red blood. But nothing serious, and nothing that would leave scars, and nothing that modern medicine could not fix in moments. But Maya did not know this, and Maya did not care about the objective assessment of her injuries because Maya was 4 years old and she had just been attacked by a falling shelf in a cold alien ship that floated millions of miles from the planet. Where her mother was buried beneath a tree they used to have picnics under. She screamed again, and this time it was not from pain, but from something much deeper, and it was a terror that came from the very core of her being, where all the losses and fears and overwhelming strangeness of her young life had been building pressure like a volcano waiting to erupt. The scream became a sob, and the sob became a wail, and the wail became a sound that Elias had never heard from his daughter before, and it was a raw and primal expression of anguish that seemed too big for her small body to contain within itself. He held her close and whispered that she was okay and that Daddy was here and that nothing was going to hurt her anymore, but she could not hear him through the storm of her own panic as her breath came in short, gasping bursts that made her whole body shake uncontrollably. She was hyperventilating, and her small chest heaved with the effort of pulling in air that never seemed to be enough, and her eyes were wide and unfocused as if she was seeing something far beyond the walls of their quarters, and something that frightened her more than falling glass ever could. Elias recognized the signs because he had seen them before in the weeks after. Sarah died when Maya would wake in the night, convinced that monsters were coming to take her away, just like they had taken Mommy. And he knew that this was not really about the cuts or the glass or the sudden violence of the emergency maneuver. This was about everything and all of it at once, and all of the pain and loss and fear crashing down on a little girl who had been trying so hard to be brave in a universe that kept proving just how scary it could be when you least expected it. Medical drones arrived within seconds, and they were summoned automatically by sensors that had detected the injury and the elevated stress responses, and they hovered into the room with their cold mechanical limbs extended and their scanning lights flickering over. Maya, like the eyes of curious predators examining wounded prey, she screamed even louder at the sight of them, and she thrashed in her father's arms as she tried to get away from the machines that looked nothing like the friendly robots in the cartoons she used to watch back on Earth when Mommy was still alive. No, 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 she shrieked, and the word became a meaningless sound repeated over and over as she buried her face against her father's chest and sobbed with her whole body shaking and trembling and breaking apart. Elias waved the drones back, and his voice was sharp with desperation as he ordered them to give her space and to wait and to not touch her until she was calm. But the machines were programmed for efficiency, and they did not understand why their medical assistance was being refused by illogical humans. They hovered at the edge of the room and waited with mechanical patience for the irrational human behavior to subside so they could complete their assigned task of treating the minor wounds. Maya cried until her voice cracked and became a hoarse whisper, and then she cried in silence with great heaving sobs that shook her frame, but produced no sound at all, and the quiet crying was somehow worse than the screaming had been. Elias rocked her gently and felt completely helpless against the tide of her despair because he had been a diplomat for 15 years, and he had negotiated trade agreements worth billions, and he had spoken before councils of beings who could destroy planets with a thought, but none of that mattered now. His little girl was breaking apart in his arms, and he did not know how to put her back together, and all his training and experience meant nothing in the face of a child's overwhelming grief. Somewhere in the vast throne chamber at the heart of the crown ship, Queen Sithara had been interrupted in the middle of receiving reports about the diplomatic incident with the Corvan hegemony that had necessitated the emergency maneuver in the first place. One of her advisors had noted an unusual reading from the human quarters, and it was an emotional distress signal of unprecedented intensity from the small one, and the Queen had turned one of her 17 eyes toward the monitoring feed with something that might have been curiosity if Velithari were capable of such inefficient emotional responses. She watched the human child scream and cry and shake with terror, and she watched the adult human hold the child and speak words that the translation systems rendered as illogical comfort phrases with no practical application whatsoever. The advisors clicked among themselves about the fascinating display of mammalian dysfunction, and they noted how the small one's stress response seemed completely disproportionate to the minor injuries she had sustained, and they observed that human children were apparently even more inefficient than their previous documentation had suggested. But the Queen said nothing as she continued to watch the feed with an attention she had not given to any lesser species in over 1,000 years of her long reign. She watched as the human father grew increasingly desperate and tried everything he could think of to calm the child, and failed again and again, and she saw something in his eyes that her ancient mind could not quite categorize or understand. It looked almost like pain, but not the physical kind that the medical drones were designed to treat, and it was something deeper and stranger that seemed to mirror the anguish of the crying child he held. The Queen did not understand what she was seeing, but she found that she could not look away, and for the first time in 3,000 years of absolute rule, she felt something that she would later learn humans called fascination. The father reached into his pocket with one hand while still holding the screaming child with the other, and he pulled out a small plastic object that the Queen's visual processors identified as a tool of unknown purpose and unidentified function. She leaned forward on her living throne, and all 17 of her ancient eyes were now fixed on the monitoring feed as she waited with unexpected anticipation to see what the strange and illogical human would do next with the mysterious object in his trembling hand. The ship was cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature, and Ambassador Elias Vance had learned this truth during his very first week aboard the Velithari crown ship, when he realized that the cold came from something much deeper than an recycled air or metal walls. He had been stationed here for 6 months now, as the first human ever permitted within the sacred halls of the insectoid empire that ruled 11 star systems with perfect efficiency and absolute logic, and every single day he woke up feeling like a warm-blooded intruder in a kingdom built for creatures who had never known warmth at all. The Velithari were ancient beyond human understanding, and their civilization stretched back over 40,000 years to a time when humans were still learning to make fire and paint pictures on cave walls. And in all that time, they had evolved into something that Elias could only describe as living mathematics given form and function. They stood nearly 8 feet tall on 6 segmented legs, and their bodies were covered in hard chitin that gleamed like polished obsidian under the bioluminescent lights of their vessel, and their heads bore 17 eyes arranged in patterns that allowed them to see in every direction, and once while missing nothing and observing everything with cold and calculating precision. Emotion was not something the Velithari understood or valued, and this was the first thing Elias had learned when the diplomatic briefings began back on Earth 2 years ago, when he was first selected for this impossible mission among the stars. There, young hatched in vast automated chambers called the Emergence vaults where thousands of larvae broke free from eggs at precisely calculated intervals. And from that very first moment of consciousness, they were fed information directly into their developing minds through neural interfaces that taught them efficiency and logic and the absolute rejection of anything that did not serve a clear and measurable purpose. There were no mothers among the Velithari, and no fathers, and no families in any sense that a human would recognize, and the concept of love was so foreign to them that their language did not even contain a word for it, but only clinical terms for biological bonding mechanisms observed in what they considered lesser species. Elias thought about this every night when he tucked his daughter into bed and kissed her forehead and told her that he loved her more than all the stars in the sky combined. Maya was 4 years old, and she was the most controversial decision of his entire diplomatic career, and the diplomatic course back on Earth had called him reckless and foolish and potentially dangerous to the entire mission when he insisted on bringing her with him to this alien vessel. But his wife, Sarah, had died 14 months before the assignment began, and she was taken by a cancer that spread too fast for even the advanced medicine of the 23rd century to stop. And Maya was all he had left in a universe that suddenly felt too large and too empty and too cruel for him to bear alone. He would not leave her behind, and not for any mission, and not for any diplomatic achievement, and not for anything the galaxy could offer him, because she was his daughter, and she needed him, and he needed her just as much. So Maya came with him to the stars as a small human child with her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and she lived now in quarters designed for beings who had never imagined that someone might want soft blankets or colorful pictures on the walls or a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Flopsy. The Velithari tolerated her presence the way one might tolerate a strange insect that had wandered into your home, and they watched her with a kind of distant curiosity mixed with faint disapproval as she skipped down the corridors, singing songs that made no sense to beings who had never understood the purpose of music or play or laughter. She was inefficient. They observed in their clicking language that Elias had learned to partially understand, and she was prone to irrational behaviors, such as laughing at nothing and crying over small injuries and asking endless questions about things that did not seem to matter. Why is the light that color, she would ask, and why do the Velithari click when they talk, and why does space look like spilled glitter, and why do you think Mommy can still see us from heaven? Daddy Elias answered every question as best he could, and he held her when she cried for her mother in the night, and he made up silly stories about space princesses and friendly aliens, and a universe where everything eventually turned out okay, even when it seemed impossible. The Velithari did not understand any of this behavior, and their reports back to their queen described the human child as a fascinating example of developmental inefficiency in mammalian species that warranted continued observation. Queen Sithara herself had ruled the Velithari Empire for over 3,000 years, and her body was kept alive through technologies that humans could barely comprehend, and her mind contained the accumulated wisdom and cold logic of a civilization that had mastered interstellar travel while humans were still building pyramids in the desert. She had never deigned to observe the human visitors directly because they were beneath her attention in the grand hierarchy of the cosmos, and they were small and short-lived and prone to the emotional weaknesses that the Velithari had bred out of themselves. Many millennia ago, Elias knew he was being watched, of course, because everything on the crown ship was watched through sensors and cameras and monitoring systems that tracked every movement and every word. But he had never expected the queen herself to take any notice of him or his daughter. He focused instead on his work, and he attended meetings with Velithari officials who discussed trade agreements and territorial boundaries in the complex politics of a galaxy filled with species who all wanted different things, and he tried his best to represent humanity with dignity, even when the aliens looked at him like he was a particularly clever animal performing tricks for their amusement. Maya played in their quarters during these meetings, and she was watched over by a monitoring system that would alert Elias if anything went wrong, and she built towers out of blocks he had brought from Earth and drew pictures with crayons and talked to Mr. Flopsy about her day in the way that children do when they are lonely, but trying to be brave. She was adapting better than he had expected, and this brave little girl, who had lost so much and been taken so far from everything she knew, was somehow finding ways to smile and laugh even in this cold and alien place. Some nights, Elias watched her sleep and felt a pride so fierce it brought tears to his eyes, because she was human, and truly and completely human, with all the messy emotions and irrational hopes and stubborn capacity for joy that the Velithari had abandoned long ago in their pursuit of perfection. The universe was vast and cold and filled with beings who had optimized themselves for efficiency and logic, but humanity brought something different to the stars and something that could not be measured or calculated, or bred out of existence no matter how hard anyone tried. They brought love and hope and the strange and wonderful ability to find beauty in things that served no practical purpose at all. Alice did not know yet how important this would become, but he would learn soon enough, when everything changed in a single terrible moment and a small plastic wand would prove more powerful than all the logic in the galaxy combined. For now, he simply tucked Maya into bed and told her a story about a princess who befriended the stars, and somewhere in the throne chamber of the crown ship 17 ancient eyes turned toward a monitoring screen for the very first time with something that might have been curiosity,